Hey pals, I'm here today to try and catch up on talking about all the books I've read since mid-August, I think is the last time I checked in with you about what I've read. So, I think I've read between 20 and 25 books since then. There's a couple I'm not going to talk about today because I really love them and I want to spend a bit more time talking about them in a separate video. I'm going to see how many I can get through today. So the first one I want to talk about, I did read in August, which was a perfect time to read it because it felt like quite a summary book, and that was Pet by Catherine Chidgey. I really enjoyed this one, would definitely recommend it. If you like coming of age narratives, but also if you like sort of dark, twisty books, this has sort of a menacing underlay to it that really does build to quite an epic conclusion. This book is set in New Zealand across two timelines, 1984 and 2001. And in 1984, we're following a young 12-year-old schoolgirl, Justine, whose mother has just died, and her father is raising her by himself. And she, along with many other students in her class, are obsessed with their teacher because she is very young and attractive and graceful, and they just think all around wonderful. And this teacher seems to make a pet of certain students, and all the students, including Justine, are desperate to be her sort of number one pet. Very early on in the novel, things of the classmates start to go missing, and the teacher begins to pit the students against one another, and it's very clear to the adult reader that the teacher is pretty racist and pretty classist because she seems to target the poorer children or the students of colour with her accusations. What unfolds, again very early in the novel, so none of this is spoilers, is that the teacher finds out that Justine's father is quite well off and very attractive and a widower, and so she sort of attaches herself to the family, and the book then follows the mystery as sort of the scales drop from Justine's eyes about her teacher, and as she strives to find out who her teacher really is, whilst the teacher tries to avoid Justine or anyone else uncovering her. There are a couple of particularly violent scenes towards the end, which I wasn't expecting. There are also a couple of real nail-biting scenes where I was super anxious for Justine and her friends. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It really works as this sort of coming-of-age narrative. It has that lovely nostalgia to it, deals really well with grief, but it also has that sort of great tension to it. And then the 2001 section is Justine with her father in a care home, and somebody working in the care home really reminds her of this teacher, and that's what's sort of making her look back and remember what happened. So I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars, and I would definitely read any other book from Catherine Chidgey. I'm hoping to read quite soon Remote Sympathy because I think that one sounds really good, so I'd be interested to know if you've read any of her books. Then we have a memoir or sort of non-fiction of sorts called The Forgotten Girls, a memoir of friendship and lost promise in rural America by Monica Potts. Ironically, I have found this one quite forgettable. I thought I could really love this one because the premise is we follow this journalist who is from Arkansas, small town Arkansas, and she looks back on the fact that she managed to get out and go away to university, and she now has this job that's really a dream for her and she really loved. But her friend Darcy, who had really similar aspirations to her, it didn't work out for, and Darcy has struggled with addiction and is a single mother and is really struggling with her mental health and financially with her children really. And the author is looking at these sort of rural parts of America and looking at what the chances are for working class women. She's looking at their sort of medical history, how young they all die, and the sort of reasons for that. And she does that through the lens of herself and her friend Darcy. I had a few issues with this. I found, so one thing in particular is she uses a fair amount of sort of facts and statistics throughout the book, and none of them are referenced, and that is a pet peeve of mine because, like, why? If you've got this fact, why wouldn't you say where it comes from? Like, it makes no sense. So that was a frustration because, you know, sometimes I do look at where the reference is from and then go and read that longer form article or get an idea of another book to read, and there was none of that, so that made me feel a bit less sort of trusting of the research. And I don't know, Darcy has agreed for this book to be written, but there's a level of, I don't know, I felt a bit of unease, and I guess the book felt somewhat muddled in what it was attempting to do. At points it felt like a memoir about the author herself. At another point it felt like this investigation into Darcy's life. It felt like it was trying to use Darcy's life as an opportunity to talk about the wider story. I don't think it always achieved that. So I liked this one, but it was a book I had to sort of keep pulling myself back to picking up, and I thought I could love it based on the premise, and sadly I didn't. The next one I listened to on audio, and this one was recommended by Jen, and that is The Curfew by T.M. Logan. I don't often read these type of, I guess like, this is like a domestic thriller mystery. I don't often read books like this, but I really felt like this type of read, and I was really into doing my puzzles the week I read this one. So I listened Richard Armitage narrate this on audio, and I quite enjoyed this. I find that I struggle to not question people's decisions in these situations, and I actually recommended this one to my mum because she reads a lot of sort of mystery thrillers, and she got to a certain point in the narrative and said to me, I just can't, like, it's ridiculous what they're doing. And I said, I completely see your point, but what I had to remind myself, and I often have to remind myself this when I watch horror films as well, is that the characters in the story don't know they're in a story. So to them, they don't know that what at the start feels like a quite small event is going to become something much worse, whereas we do, right? We're picking up this mystery book or we're watching this horror film, we know things are going to get worse. So sometimes their reactions don't feel adequate, but that's because they don't know the story they're in. So premise of this is that we're following this from the perspective of a father, and he is the local GP, and one night his teenage son comes home, he hears him come home, he sort of goes in to check on him and sees he's in his bed. And then the next day, he finds out that his nephew has gone missing, who is the same age as his teenage son, and they're friends. And when he goes to check his son to be like, where is your cousin? The boy in the bed isn't actually his son. So now it's like, actually, his son is missing, not just the nephew. And so there's a lot more to the story than that. I don't really want to give away any more than that because that's all you get in the blurb. I quite enjoyed this. I think if I felt like reading a sort of mystery thriller again, I'd pick up another book by this author. I particularly liked Richard Armitage's narration. I didn't love this, and like I said, I did just find their actions at the start quite unbelievable. There's a lot of points at which things seem to be getting bad, and they keep saying they're going to like talk to somebody, I can't give away who, to like try and find out more. And then they just sort of let hours go by before they do that and like are pretty chill about it. And I didn't really understand that. Like I said, had to remind myself they don't know they're in this book. But yeah, so this was like an enjoyable read for me. Didn't love it, but would probably give another book by this author a go. Then I read a debut novel, and that is I Will Greet the Sun Again by Kashaya J. Kabishani. This is about three brothers who are Iranian American, and quite early on in the narrative, their father takes them in the dead of night and takes them away from their mother and takes them to Iran. We follow the period whilst they're in Iran, and then they get back to their mother, and you sort of follow that period. You follow from each of their perspectives, and yeah, there's quite a lot going on. And this is a very short novel, I think around 200 pages. I get the sense from interviews with the author that a lot of this is based on their own life, and one of the brothers in particular is based on them. There were points in this that I thought were great, like there were certain scenes with the mother or certain scenes with the boys with their friends that I really liked the writing, but I found this novel to be quite confused and to be trying to do way too much in the length of the book. Like I felt like this book could be like 350 pages and be a much stronger narrative. So yeah, it felt to me like there was way too much, not to say it's really plotty, but a lot happened in a short space of time, and especially in terms of like themes being dealt with. So for me, this ended up being a bit of a disappointment in terms of what I was hoping for, but I can see that the author definitely has some great writing skills. I think this happens often with debut novels. They want to pack everything into the first novel and find it hard with what to cut. So I would follow this author in the future and see what else he brings out. The next book is Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily R. Austin. Now, I don't often read books that are described as humorous because I think that's really subjective, but I'd heard this book be compared to Fleabag, and I like the sound of the premise. So I really enjoyed this one. The premise of this is we are following this woman in her 30s, and she's really struggling with her mental health, and one day she walks past a Catholic church that has a flyer advertising free therapy. So she walks in to try and get some therapy, and the priest, I get really confused by which religions have like priests and vicars, pretty sure it's a priest, thinks that she is there to apply for the job of receptionist because their receptionist has recently passed away. And she needs a job, she feels really awkward, so she goes along with it. And she ends up working in this church. She has to pretend to be Catholic and not to be queer. And she becomes really interested in the receptionist who worked there before her. She receives some emails from the receptionist's friends who don't realise she's dead because they're sort of long distance friend, and she sort of goes along with them and like pretends the friend isn't dead. And she just sort of gets wrapped up in all these odd situations and starts to, sort of investigate what happened to the previous receptionist. And it sounds really weird when you describe it. It is quite a weird, quirky novel, but I felt like it had a lot of heart to it. She is one of those characters where you watch and you're like, oh no, like, why are you doing this? Like, this is so absurd. But I think it had enough warmth to it. I often feel disconnected from those type of characters, and I didn't feel disconnected from this character. I think it had enough warmth to it, and I really liked sort of spending time with these people and just seeing what things happened. So I would definitely read another book from this author. The next book is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. I've been meaning to pick up a book from this author because I hear people talk about his books quite often. I listened to this one on audio. The premise of this is that two men meet one another. It says a black father, a white father, two murdered sons, a quest for vengeance. So basically, their sons were married and neither of them were really very supportive of their sons being queer. And then their sons have recently been murdered, and the white father approaches the black father and is like, I'm aware we both used to be in prison because we were involved in quite violent acts, and so let's do something about what happened to our sons. And they start to investigate. What I'd heard about S.A. Cosby is that his books are pretty violent, and they are. There's some really violent scenes. Not as bad as I was expecting. I don't know what that says about me. There's things I wouldn't read. But what I mean is there's scenes where they sort of try and get information out of people. They'll do things like break their fingers and stuff, which is obviously not nice, but there's things beyond that I wouldn't want to read about. So if you've been unsure about the level of violence in this book, there is a lot of guns, there's a lot of, explosions, there's a lot of quite tense scenes. Quite a lot happens in this. They get involved in some people they probably don't want to be involved with, and there's this sort of mystery they're trying to solve, and shit goes down. Now, I enjoyed this one. I'd probably read another book from this author. I think I was hoping for a bit more from it. Like, the writing is serviceable, and I do think that I probably would have enjoyed this less if I hadn't listened to it on audio, because I think the audiobook narrator did a really good job. There was a scene in this as well where a decision was made that was just absurd, and it's beyond the point of they don't know they're in a novel, because shit had already got pretty bad. So they knew what level of risk they were involved in, and just a really stupid decision was made that was so obvious. So I find that frustrating, because it's the author wants to get from point A to point B, and so they just make the characters make a really stupid and reckless decision in order to get to point B. Just come up with a more convincing plot line for me to believe that, because that sort of lessened the impact of the book and the characters' decisions for me. This book is saying a lot about homophobia and about racism, and I think the author does that in a way that is maybe, this is for all different types of readers, and maybe people who haven't thought all that much about those things. This is two men who aren't big talkers, and so are sort of grappling with actually thinking about these things and talking about these things for, some of the first time. And I think that's sort of the level it is at in terms of the readership. But I think it dealt with those things well. And I would sort of be interested in seeing what this author, what his other books are about. The next one I read was Love and Virtue by Diana Reid. I meant to read this one for a couple of years, and she recently had a new book come out, which reminded me that I wanted to read her previous book. This is a university novel. It is set in Australia, and the premise of this is that these two young women, I can't remember how much you're told in the blurb. It says, Michaela and Eve are two bright, bold women who befriend each other their first year at a residential college at university, where they live in adjacent rooms. They could not be more different, one assured and popular, the other uncertain and eager to please. But something happens one night in O Week, a drunken encounter, a foggy memory that will force them to confront the realities of consent and wrestle with the dynamics of power. So it doesn't really give much away. Okay, so I'll be careful with what I say. The premise is that you're told in the prologue about this drunken encounter, and you're told it from like an external perspective, and then you follow these two women on from that point. That drunken encounter sort of comes back up later in the novel, and there's a big discussion surrounding consent and sexism. But a big focus of this novel is class and power. Michaela is one of the less wealthy students at this residential college. She's surrounded by really wealthy people who are very used to their wealth, very used to their privilege and the power that comes with that. And Eve represents some quite sort of left-wing, what she would, I guess, class as like radical views. She's incredibly articulate. She can hold her own in an argument. She's very well known around campus. But this book has an interesting discussion about power, especially between class and gender. For example, there is a relationship in this novel, you know, like a professor-student relationship that's sort of part of that commentary. And I guess who has the right to tell a story, and if somebody has the right to use a story, if they're using it with good intentions, do they have a right to it? It's very interesting. I would read something else this author wrote. I think I was hoping for a bit more from it. I will say that I think it was really interesting. I think it was really smart. But I do think the narrative about the older male teacher and his younger student has been done to death a bit, and I don't think this book offered anything new on that. So I think I'd have been more interested in the focus more being on the two women. Now I understand why that was part of the narrative, because it spoke even more about power and consent and how some people can feel in the moment like they hold the power, but actually in terms of wider context of society they don't. But yeah, I just think it's been a little bit overdone, and it's something I'm not that interested in reading about. But yeah, I would definitely read another book from this author. This was probably like a 3.5-star read for me. Then I started making progress on my autumn-winter TBR. The first book I read from that was The Outcast by Sadie Jones. This is a historical fiction novel set in the 1950s, just outside London. The premise of this is sort of told across two timelines. So the opening chapter, we are following a young man who's only around 20, and he's just getting out of prison. He's been there for a couple of years, and he's returning to his hometown, to his father and his father's younger wife, and it's very clear that he's not really welcomed by them or by the rest of the people in the village. We then go back to the past when Lewis was around 10, and we sort of see some of his childhood, and we learn very early on that his mother died in quite a horrific freak accident, which Lewis was sort of partly held responsible for, and that radically changed the way he communicated with others and I guess his mental health. And then you watch the narrative in that timeline build up to the act that makes him go to prison, and in the present, from the moment he gets out of prison, things start to get worse and build up to this sort of other narrative. Now, the first half of this book I loved. I really enjoyed Amy and Lan from this author, which is her newest novel that I think I read last year. And I was sort of surprised by the fact that this didn't have really great ratings on Goodreads and Storygraph, because I was really loving that first half. I thought it wrote really beautifully about that time period. I thought that the coming of age narrative was really good. I thought that the discussions about the role of women and the depression that a lot of women would have felt, these sort of kept women who are just told you've just got to sit at home all day and sort of keep up appearances and go out in society. These women who are incredibly intelligent and articulate and desperately bored with their lives. I thought it was really interesting in its discussion of all that. However, in the sort of present day narrative of the novel, when Lewis is out of prison, I won't spoil anything, but there is an aspect of that narrative that becomes very insta-lovey. There is also quite an age gap between the two characters involved, and that isn't really commented on. The age gap isn't the problem, it's the ages they are. If they were both older, it's not that big an age gap, but it is quite a big age gap at the ages they are. And yeah, the insta-love and then the actions because of that insta-love are so over the top. So you move from this quite slow, meandering novel in the first half to just loads of shit happening, and it just feels quite excessive, and yeah, I just didn't love where it ended up. So I did like this book, and I will definitely continue to read her other books because I really like her writing style. On a sentence by sentence level, she's a great author. If you enjoy authors like Sarah Waters, I would definitely recommend Sadie Jones' writing. But yeah, I just didn't love where this one went. I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on this one. I think it was quite an interesting novel. Then we have a graphic non-fiction, the first one being Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton. This is the first book I've read by Kate Beaton, but she's quite well known for her comic book Hark a Vagrant, which I do need to read. Now, what I didn't know before I picked this one up, and I found out about halfway through, and it made a lot of sense to me, is that this book, so Kate Beaton went to work after university on the oil sands, and in order to pay off her university debt and go back to university to study. And while she was doing that, she was publishing a cartoon on her, I think her online blog. And that cartoon omitted a lot of the commentary on gender dynamics and gendered violence in the communities in which she was living. And she later sort of reassessed that and released this book, which is those original comic strips, but with lots more comic strips added, which deal with the subjects that were omitted. So when you get to the end of this memoir, there is an actual sort of few-page essay that comments on that, comments on the fact that she felt she was sort of complicit in the silence around the community that happens in these type of places. And so this book is about that. What that means is that this book is very much like individual cartoon strips. We could be on one page and talking about something and then it would suddenly jump, and I find that quite confusing. I've realised that I don't really think these type of graphic artists work for me. I prefer somebody who develops something to be told as one whole narrative, because I just find myself getting a bit confused. And there'd be like a jokey scene, and then there'd be a scene with, you know, there's a lot of sexual assault discussed and on the page in this book, and I think these are topics that really need to be spoken about, and a lot of more work needs to be done about this, you know. So the men outnumber the women by a radical number, and because of that there's this sort of microcosm created in which the men are really explicitly sexual to the women and feel that they can say and do whatever they want, and it's a pretty awful place to be as a woman, particularly as a young woman. So yeah, I think what was being said was interesting here, and I certainly enjoyed some of the comic book strips, but to me it's quite a big comic book and it just felt too bitty. So what I will say is that I read Oh Beautiful by Jung Yun, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, and it deals with a similar topic, but with the sort of added element of discussing racism as well. And I think because of the length of that book, it has a lot more space to delve a lot more into the subject. So if you are interested in that subject, that is another book I would recommend about it. Then I read A Guest in the House by Emily Carroll, which is her new graphic novel, and I really enjoyed this one. I don't really feel like I can say much. So this bit of the blurb says, a young woman marries a kind dentist only to discover a dark mystery surrounding his former wife's death. So what did I enjoy about this? I really enjoyed the queer, what I would say, overtones. I think it's fairly clear, even from the first few pages, that our protagonist is queer and is sort of muddling through her life, is quite depressed because she's not really living the life she intended. She's married to this man and sort of raising his daughter, and yeah, sort of trying to work her way through her loneliness and her depression, and she becomes interested in his deceased wife and starts to see her ghost. Now, most of this book is in like grayscale, but there are panels of incredibly vivid colour, which is something I love about Emily Carroll's art. And those pages are quite gruesome in their sort of gory detail, and I love them. And I don't really want to spoil much about them, but what I will say is that the book went somewhere I didn't expect at all, and maybe I should have seen it coming, but I really didn't. And this is one that when I finished it, I was like, what the fuck just happened? And I immediately went and tried to find loads of other people's reviews online to try and like see what other people thought that final panel meant, because I was a bit confused. And I think you're supposed to feel sort of like that. There are elements of this book that feel a bit, have the touch of the unreal to them, and you sort of have to question everything. I think this would be an interesting one to reread, to sort of spot hints and clues. And there's a really interesting sort of metaphor throughout this, especially in the coloured panels, about Abby seeing herself as this knight who needs to sort of save this princess. And I think the imagery around that was beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. So I would definitely recommend that one. A book I didn't enjoy is a short story collection, Peach Pit, 16 Stories of Unsavoury Women. This was edited by Molly Llewellyn and Christelle Buckley. And the only story I can remember that I actually enjoyed, I can remember a lot that I didn't enjoy. The one I did enjoy was the first one. It was a story by Disha Filior, and that was a disappointment because I knew I enjoyed her work because I'd read The Secret Lives of Church Ladies and really enjoyed it. So I was hoping to find more authors to enjoy. I think this was just entirely the wrong collection for me. These stories are quite violent and grotesque and very much written for horror readers, I'd say. Majority of these stories were, but just in a way that I don't really like. Some of it just feels like it's done for shock value. That's not something I really enjoy as a reader. And the ones that were more realistic and like less horrifying, other than Disha Filior's, I just felt were a bit flat. Like, they were the type of short stories where I read them and I feel how when people who say they don't like short stories are like, yeah, I just don't think there was enough to it, like whatever. They made me feel like that. They weren't strong enough to just be this standalone piece. They're the sort of stories that I would think someone would write and then not put in the collection. So yeah, this one didn't work for me at all. You know, there was a lot of stories I just didn't like. There's one I skipped entirely. I tried the first page and I was just like, absolutely not. And there were a couple that I just wish I could wipe from my brain because they were pretty gross. So that one wasn't for me. The next one was The Vanishing of Avalon Jones by Phil Hicks. This is the third book in the Avalon Jones series and sadly was my least favourite. Each of the books are set in a certain season, this one being winter, and we follow a young girl called Avalon Jones who makes this friend, and in each book they are on one of their holidays from school and they go to stay somewhere different in the UK, and they come across this local ghost story or sort of folklore. In this one, it is a bit of folklore. Her uncle has gone missing and she thinks he might have been taken away by the Fae. And so they start to investigate this. Now, the reason I didn't enjoy this one anywhere near as much is that this one is pretty heavy on the plot and it didn't have as much space for character development, and what I felt the first two books had is a lot of just moments of like quiet between the friends and like just nice little moments where they like sip hot chocolate and stuff. And I get this is a children's book, but I felt with this one that the resolution was a bit ridiculous in that like the police and everybody else just wouldn't buy the story that they have to give to cover up the mystery. So yeah, this one I just felt just went a bit too far. I will say there were points in it that were quite scary, and I think had I read this book as a child, I would have been quite frightened. So this one might be the scariest of the three, but I felt that the overall plot was the weakest. Okay, so I think I'm going to talk about 3 more books because I've been talking for ages now and I need to rest my throat. So the first one is Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. This is the first book I've read by this author, and I'd heard a lot of people rave about this one, and I just really felt like an easy book that might make me feel like quite cheerful, and I thought this one might fit the bill, and it sort of did. I really enjoyed the first half of this, and it's quite odd because I've heard some criticisms of the first half, which I agree with. So the premise of this is that we're following this woman called Sally, who is a sketch writer for a show called Night Owls, which I think is based on... Is it based on Saturday Night Live? I don't know. So the premise is that she's written this sketch about the fact that a lot of her male co-workers have started dating much younger, much more attractive and much more successful celebrity women who come on the show to do a sketch, but how that's never happened the other way around. Like, there's never been a sort of less attractive, less successful woman who started dating a more attractive, more successful man. Around the time she writes that sketch, this famous singer called Noah comes on the show to do a sketch, and they start to become quite friendly, and there's this sort of flirtation. Now, the criticisms of the first half of the book is that there's way too much detail about how this type of show works, and I completely agree. I could have done without all the like inside baseball stuff. I guess Curtis Sittenfeld has like an interest in these type of shows. It was a little bit boring, a bit too much detail, but I find I don't read many romance books, but when I do read romance books or books that have an element of a romance, some of my favourite bits are like the start, when there's like a question of like, am I attracted to this person? Are they attracted to me? And they just have these first few conversations or meetings. I quite like that. And so I quite enjoyed that initial section. Then the middle of the book is taken up by a chunk of emails. This book is set across several years because there's this sort of misunderstanding. And then, we have all these emails that are written during lockdown. And then, we have the sort of third act. And I guess I enjoyed the emails, and then the third act, the bit that I should probably enjoy the most, I guess I just maybe by that point felt a bit done with it. I read this in like 2 sittings. I found it really compelling to get through. I sort of felt really giddy when I started it, and then enjoyed it a bit less at the end. However, I am intrigued by this author. I did find her writing really easy to get through, super readable, and so I am definitely going to give another of her books a go. I'm tempted by Prep because I really love a school novel. I know it's got really mixed reviews, so let me know if you've read many of her books and what your thoughts are on them. And the next one is The Fraud by Zadie Smith. I listened to this one on audio when we read this for my Patreon book club, and we didn't have a great success with it, if I'm being honest. I feel much the same as I've heard many other people say. I started reading this book, I was listening to it on audio, it's narrated by the author, brilliantly narrated. And I felt like I was just in love with it. Felt like this was going to be a 5-star read. It was so smart, so witty, so funny. Just loved it. And then maybe 80 pages in, I started to think it's just much of the same. Like, there is no real plot. It's very confusing. All the chapters are like 2 or 3 pages, which is very frustrating. And I don't know why she did it. And it jumps around a lot. The blurb says that the premise is that there's this trial called the Tichborne trial. All the characters in this book, by the way, were real people. So there's this real life trial called the Tichborne trial, at which a man who is believed to have been dead for many years reappears and says, I'm that guy, but he looks and speaks and is radically different from that man, and is actually thought to be like this working class butcher from this other part of London. But there is a man called Andrew Bogle who grew up on a slave plantation in Jamaica and has been the sort of servant of a member of this family, is vouching for him and is saying, no, that is Andrew Bogle. And so people were fascinated by this case. They were also interested because a lot of people, their only awareness at the time of black people were as people who were enslaved in the Caribbean. And here was this man who was incredibly well-spoken, incredibly articulate, soft-spoken, and was very much adored by the crowds. And so, it became a really famous case. And we're following this woman as she becomes sort of interested in this case. And so I enjoyed Andrew Bogle's story. There's a section of the novel told from his perspective. I thought that was good. I initially enjoyed Eliza's story. There's a lot of the narrative that is focused on her cousin, who is an author, and there's a lot of the narrative that is focused in the past, around the time when he was a more successful author and he mixed with people like Charles Dickens, and I just didn't give a shit. There were just so many scenes of dinner parties where Charles Dickens was attending and loads of other authors, and they're all just having a chat, and it just goes on and on and on, and I'm sure I missed loads of nuances. But I just bored. Like, there's not really any plot to this. And when you describe the trial, it makes it sound like there's a really interesting plot. And there just isn't. Like, that doesn't really go anywhere. I think this book is trying to say a lot of things, but I don't know if I was bright enough to understand it. So on a sentence by sentence level, like, this is great. And she can really write. But this book really makes me question her decisions, because the chapter length was just silly, and I don't know, the lack of plot was, there was never any marker of when the time had changed. You sort of knew what year you were in based on whether Charles Dickens was alive or dead, so that got quite confusing. So yeah, this was a mixed bag for me. I still think she is a great writer, but I think this one wasn't her best. And the last book I'm going to talk about, I've read it as well, I know everyone is reading this one, is The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. I listened to this on audio, Michelle Williams narrates it beautifully. It was initially quite odd listening to Michelle Williams read Britney Spears' memoir, but I think in the end I enjoyed it more than I would if I'd just read it. Now this, I think, was ghostwritten. I'm not sure what the ghostwriter's name is. And so I've heard a lot of critique of the writing style in this one. And what I'll say is I read a fair amount of memoirs, although I haven't read as many as I'd like to this year. But I tend to read memoirs by people who are completely unknown, just because I think their life sounds interesting and the way they've written about it sounds interesting. I don't tend to read memoirs from the perspective of famous people. But last year I listened to I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy, and I thought her discussion about celebrity and fame and wealth from an early age was really interesting. So when I had people start to murmur about this Britney Spears memoir, I just thought, I'm going to give it a go. And so you don't go to this book for brilliant writing. Is this well written? No. Is it a bit jumbled? Yes. However, I will say the first half I think is definitely stronger. I think the writing about her childhood and her confusion around her relationship with Justin Timberlake and her struggles when she was initially famous, I think were really interesting. And yeah, I found, just really compelling. I think when she starts to talk about and I hate saying this word, conservatorship, I think things get a bit more jumbled, and I think she jumps around a lot more, and I think it's clear that she's still processing a lot of it and is still quite confused by a lot of it. And that part of her life is fit into quite a few pages compared to how much time is taken up with other things. And so I sort of am okay with that, because it must have been an awful time to live through, let alone to relive. So I'm glad I listened to this one. I found it really interesting. Definitely found the first half better written and more interesting. But I think it's really important that she gets her voice out there. I think that what was allowed to happen to her could happen to someone of her wealth and power and fame in this day and age. Just goes to show how it is still entirely possible for people to silence women and to say they're mad and to get them institutionalised and to keep them there for as long as possible. And that's fucking bleak. And I think it's a really important thing that people talk about. And so I think it was a worthwhile memoir to have out there. And I enjoyed it. Some of it was just a bit juicy as well. I'm not all that interested in celebrity gossip and stuff, but I do think some of her discussions about the way in which she was treated compared to the way in which Justin was treated were interesting. I think her commentary on sort of feminism and power and gender are quite shallow, but I think hearing her talk about that in relation to the music industry was interesting. So yeah, I'm glad I listened to this one. Is it a masterpiece? No, of course not. But were we expecting it to be? No. So yeah, those are my thoughts on however many books I just spoke about. I have no idea. So I would love to know if you have read any of the books I spoke about, and if you have, what your thoughts were on them. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.